pushing direction to my radar.
Great career in palliative care and geropsych.
What's that?
She's had a great career in palliative care and geropsych. Let's see if I can do this.
What's going on? Get back to bed.
Feel young again. Centrum Silver.
Okay, well, I guess I should wire up here. This actually started a few years ago when, I don't know, for some reason, I forget why this was on my mind. It had to do with the theories on aging class in the PhD program back when Vern Bingston was teaching it, and I was bugging Vern about the fact that my students that were taking the class didn't seem to get any exposure to psychological theories of aging, and Vern said, "Are there psychological theories of aging?" And it's actually kind of an interesting question. There's at least one, but that's another story. There certainly are like models and kind of themes in psychology and aging. And actually, since then, Vern's book on theories of aging has had sections on psychological theories. But certainly reductionist models, which we'll be particularly looking at in the next few class sessions, are attempts to find kind of simple psychological processes that explain a lot of different things that are going on in the aging, psychology of aging and the aging brain. Early on, meaning like late 50s to early 60s or so, Jim Buren had kind of proposed the Buren hypothesis, which is, in its strong form anyway, is the idea that pretty much all changes in cognitive aging are just due to the fact that we're slowing down. And then in fact, apparent changes in memory, learning, attention, and so forth, all have to do with slowing. It's not always advocated in that strong a form, and sometimes it's in the more kind of moderate form that most changes are due to slowing, or that slowing has an effect on a lot of different things. It's actually sort of fell into disfavor for a decade or two, and there was a lot more attention to kind of more specific other processes. And then in the last few years, it's kind of come back, especially at the level of understanding the relationship of age and intelligence. It's turning out that speed, especially perceptual speed, does seem to explain a lot of what's going on in intelligence. We'll be talking about that in detail later on in the course as well. And actually, one of the things that kind of comes up is what exactly do you mean by speed, and what are you measuring? And one of the changes from the 60s to now is a shift from kind of talking about reaction time kind of speed, seeing a light and hitting a lever kind of speed, to perceptual processing speed is what people are mostly looking at. Localization is kind of more the idea that aging involves particular brain areas if you're focusing on the hardware or particular information processing components, which kind of gets us down into the next group of models, if you're focusing more on the kind of software analogy here. Different things have been popular at different times. For a while, there was kind of a right hemisphere, left hemisphere thing about the brain. These days, a lot of people that are focused on cognitive neuroscience and neuropsych have a kind of frontal lobe versus the rest of the brain kind of thing going. The evidence for the brain localization stuff is actually not all that great. Little better for some of the information processing components. And then Tim Salthouse, the other part of the Essential Papers volume, I mentioned Lawton a few minutes ago. Salthouse is on the other side of this. Salthouse, I was starting around 1990 or so, has advocated different versions of kind of cognitive resources models. And which ones he's focused on kind of depends on what's going on in the research world at any one time. But again, speed is a big part of it. Attentional focus is another kind of cognitive resource, and working memory is yet another kind of cognitive resource. You'll be learning about all of these again in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Information processing models, there's two kind of different versions of this, although you can see the second one is embedded in the other one. There's kind of a computer metaphor model of cognition, generally tending to focus on the software rather than the hardware. So you're kind of thinking about what are the cognitive processes, depending on whether they also are involved in cognitive neuroscience. People in cognitive psych are not necessarily interested in where in the brain things are happening, but they're interested in the cognitive processes for their own right. Funding streams have made it harder and harder to focus only on the software the last decade or so. Almost everybody has to have some kind of biomarker or brain imaging component in their research, but there is kind of a tradition going back several decades of just looking at the software side of the information processing system. Again, you'll get an introduction to that next week. Long-term memory, which is where everything is once you've learned it. There's a lot of kind of popular ways of making distinctions about short and long-term memory that really don't work in cognitive psych. People say things like, short-term memory is what I had for breakfast this morning, and long-term memory is, what I was doing when I was 12. In the cognitive psych model, once you're no longer focusing on something, or once you're no longer rehearsing it, trying to learn it, it's either in your long-term memory or it's gone. Again, we'll talk more about this. And so it could be, as recently as things that you learned, like, 5 minutes ago or before the break, or even, what I said like 2 minutes ago if you've gotten distracted in the meantime and forgot to remember it or make notes of it and so forth. So there's a real sense of like things getting filtered from your everyday experience to what actually ends up in long-term store. And for ages and ages, psychology has had this kind of associationist view of long-term memory, meaning that the way you get from one memory to another is that they're sort of associated in different ways. They can be associated by experience, that you just happen to experience these things together. They can be associated because you deliberately associated them, like you might if you're doing mnemonic cues to remember things. They can be associated because the meanings of things are kind of intrinsically related. So like nurse and doctor are probably associated ideas in your mind just because the meanings of those terms are related to one another. And as you branch into emotion theory, emotional tones of things also get associated with your memories in similar kinds of ways. And so we'll talk about how this develops over time with aging, but a simple view is that the